Welcome to the Community Eligibility Provision New Applicants Training. My name is Bakiba, and I will be your operator for today's call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct a question-and-answer session. Please note that this conference is being recorded. I will now turn the call over to Bridget Hires. Bridget, you may begin.
Thank you so much, and welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you're here today to hear about the Community Eligibility Provision. This webinar is intended for new applicants to the Community Eligibility Provision. Of course, we welcome anybody who is listening in, but what we're mainly going to take a look at today is what is the Community Eligibility Provision, if your school or school district might be eligible to participate in this program, and some of the positives and negative attributes about being on the Community Eligibility Provision in order for new applicants to really have all the information together to make an informed decision about this particular provision of the National School Lunch Program. As mentioned, this will be recorded, and we will have this posted onto our Ohio Department of Education website. And we also will make the PowerPoint presentation available to all participants. So don't feel like you have to be scribbling down everything. Just kind of sit back, relax, and let's talk about the Community Eligibility Provision. So as I had mentioned before, we're just going to do a general overview of what the Community Eligibility Provision is. We'll talk about some eligibility requirements. Some things to consider. I like to always give both the positive and the negative aspect because there's always two sides to a story. We'll talk about some of the facts in terms of what it means for a school to be on community eligibility, documentation-wise, how they'll go about reporting, things along that nature for the general program aspect. And then we'll take time to have questions and answers. So if you can keep all your questions and answers for the end of the webinar, just kind of be jotting them down as we go through. Then we'll take some time to address those at the end. So I know this is a very wordy slide. I kind of apologize for that. But basically what the Community Eligibility Provision is, it was introduced with the most recent reauthorization of the Child Nutrition Programs in 2010. And what it aims to do is to utilize information poverty data as opposed to a school having to collect those paper-free and reduced-price meal application forms. And the poverty data is used to determine what meal reimbursement rates that a school will receive. It's based on a proportion of meals, a percentage, if you will, as opposed to individually knowing by student if they're free, reduced, or paid. And we'll talk a lot more about that here in the next couple of slides. It's a 4-year reimbursement provision, and it's intended for high poverty local education agencies. Now, when I say it's a 4-year provision, a school can be on this provision for 4 years. But if they find out it's not financially advantageous to be on the provision, at the end of any given school year, they can decide to discontinue being on Community Eligibility Provision and return back to more traditional methods. So it is a 4-year program, but you're not locked in any certain way. We certainly don't want a school or school district to get into a provision that ends up not being financially feasible and feel like they are stuck in that provision. So that is untrue. Also, an LEA could decide to be on community eligibility for one of their schools, all of their schools, or a grouping of schools. And we'll talk more about what that looks like here in the next couple of slides. So how do you know if you can be on the community eligibility provision or not? What you're going to want to do is, dependent on the school or group of schools that you may be interested in this provision for, you're going to pull the active enrollment list as of April 1st of 2015. So from a couple weeks ago, on that particular date, what students were actively enrolled in the school or schools that are interested in participating in the community eligibility provision. Once you have that, what you're going to do is decide based on those actively enrolled students who, kind of as a supplement as well, have access to the school meal program. So if the children don't regularly participate in the school meal program, which may be the case of maybe split-day kindergarten or preschool kids, if they don't have access to the meal program, you do not want to include them in your counts. If they do, then you do want to include those children in your enrollment counts. So it's all kids in a school or school that were actively enrolled as of April 1st that have access to the school meal programs. That's your enrollment count. And then you'll decide on those kids how many of those kids meet a category called identified students, which we'll talk in depth about here in the next slide. I'm going to reiterate this several times, and it might become comical after a while, that this identified student count is not your free and reduced meal count or reduced student count. You basically, when making a decision to be on community eligibility, you cannot take any information whatsoever off of a paper free and reduced price meal form. All of the information for this identified student count has to come from other data sources. If you are on CEP, you have to agree to serve no-cost lunches and no-cost breakfast to all students, regardless if they would or would not have qualified for free or reduced lunches had you been collecting those paper applications. That basically doesn't matter. All the kids are on the same playing field in community eligibility provision and receive a no-cost breakfast and a no-cost lunch for the number of years that you participate in community eligibility provision. Now, in thinking about being on community eligibility provision, we have some tools that a school can fill out to see if it's a financially viable option or not on our website, and I'll speak about those here a little bit later. Well, if your reimbursement that you bring in, the federal reimbursement, perhaps doesn't cover all the cost of producing the meals for the school meal program, the school will have to find non-federal funding sources that will offset that deficit, if you will. If the nonprofit food service account has a balance, a positive balance, that positive balance cannot be used to offset any deficit of being on the community eligibility provision. You also have to agree not to collect any of those paper free and reduced price meal application forms that have the USDA information on it. If you're on community eligibility provision, you are using other data sources to determine if kids are identified students or not, and therefore you don't need to collect and are not authorized to collect those paper free and reduced price meal application forms. And we'll talk about how that can impact other offices and processes within a school or school district. You have to maintain the total count of breakfasts and lunches served to students at the point the students still receive them. So we get some schools that get confused and say, well, if all kids are going a no-cost breakfast and a no-cost lunch, then I don't have to count the meals anymore. I know how many students are in the building, and I'll just record that count. Well, that's not allowed. You still have to record when the students get the meal that they, in fact, did get a reimbursable meal. But the beauty of it is you won't need to know by child who, by name, if you will, who got the meal. You'll just need to maintain an accurate count of students that participated. And that can be accomplished by either using a tally sheet or a numbering system where you just cross off numbers as the kids come through, or even a clicker system. But an actual count when the kids get the meal still has to be maintained. And if we happen to have any of our friends from residential child care institutions looking at this webinar today, residential child care institutions are not eligible to participate in the community eligibility provision. So who exactly are we talking about when we talk about that identified student definition? Basically, you're looking at all of your categorical eligible students. Your main one, of course, is going to be the kids that appear on your direct certification match list. So of all the direct certification matches that have been accomplished from July 1st of 2014 up to April 1st of 2015, you can use all of those different match lists, and what you're going to do is you're going to compare the names on those match results lists to that active student enrollment as of April 1st and try to find as many names on the match list as compared to the enrollment. So, for example, if Sally Allen was enrolled as of April 1st, you would look at all of your direct certification match lists to see if you see Sally Allen's name. And if you do, you'll give Sally Allen a little check mark, and you'll move down to the next child's name. Once you do that, what you'll basically do is count the number of kids that you were able to check mark that you had that data for were categorically eligible. And that will help you to count up your identified student count. Now, this does include any students that are in a household of a student that was on a direct cert match list. So, for example, if Sally Allen was actively enrolled April 1st, and you found Sally Allen on a direct certification match list, you can check Sally Allen as being one of these identified students. But let's say Sally also has Timothy Russell in her household, and Timothy doesn't show up on a direct certification match list. You can actually check mark Timothy Russell as well, and you may want to write a little note, direct cert based on Sally Allen. Timothy Russell can also be counted now as part of your identified student count through the extending direct certification benefits to other children in the household. That is allowed. So those are two different opportunities you have to find the students who are your identified students. On your direct certification match results list, you'll notice that it shows up if a child was directly certified based on SNAP or OWS now. It's in kind of the far right-hand column. Any student who shows up on the direct certification match list that is also enrolled as of April 1st can be check-marked as part of your identified student count. Some other categories are if you have a homeless liaison or a runaway liaison and they've identified students during the 14-15 school year who meet those definitions, then what you need from them is a list of the students and have your homeless or runaway liaison sign and date that list, and all of those students can also be counted as part of this identified student count. If you happen to have a federal Head Start program, so if your preschoolers are actually an official federal Head Start program, and whoever the coordinator of that should know if they are, and if they don't, then have them give us a call at our office and we'll help figure out if they're an official federal Head Start program. But if they are, all of those students in the Head Start program can automatically be counted as part of this identified student count as long as those Head Start kids have access to the school meals. You'll count them as both your enrolled students and as your identified students. Kids in preschool are not automatically qualified as an identified student. So number one, you have to ask, if it's not a federal Head Start program, you ask yourself, do the kids have access to the meals? And if the preschoolers do in fact eat the school meals, you would include them in your enrolled student counts, and then any of your preschoolers who are directly certified or in a household of a directly certified student, or if they're homeless, runaway, or migrant, you can count them as part of your identified student count as well. We've had a couple of schools, for some reason, have just automatically counted their preschool kids as part of their identified student count, and you can't do that unless it is a federal Head Start program. you would treat those kids basically like any other child in the district that has access to the program. You would need to know if they're an identified student or not for CEP purposes. Now, for foster children, there's two different ways a district can know if a child is a foster child for school meal purposes, and that's from a paper application, which cannot be used in this situation for identified student count purposes. But if the district has in its possession court documentation that affirms a child is a foster child, and that court documentation is dated from the 2014-2015 school year, then you actually can take that into consideration and count that foster child as part of your identified student count. We've had some districts that have counted foster children because they had court documentation, but the court documentation has been fairly dated from years ago. You can only count those foster kids if you have possession of current court documentation affirming that they are foster students. Okay, so again, you take your enrollment as of April 1st, actively enrolled students who have access to the meal program, and check mark as many of them as you can find their names on the direct certification match list or extended benefits or homeless, migrant, runaway, or any of the categories we just talked about. And what you're going to do is you're going to figure out your count of students that you have. And you're going to you're going to make that into a percentage. So you'll take your identified students divided by your enrolled students, and that will give you your direct certification or identified student percentage. Now, USDA knows that obviously those are not the only kids in the school or district that would qualify for free and reduced meals if you were still counting if you were still collecting your applications, if you will. So what they've developed is a multiplier of 1.6. Now, this multiplier is intended to take into account any students that would have qualified for the meal program had you still been collecting paper applications. So you'll take your identified student percentage in the blue box that we just talked about, multiply it by the 1.6 multiplier in the green box on this slide, and that will give you what proportion of meals you can claim at the free meal percentage. And I know that it probably doesn't make a lot of sense right now, so I'm actually going to skip over a couple of slides and come to this slide because I think this will help us visualize this. So our example is we have School A that has 100 students with access to the school lunch and school breakfast program that are actively enrolled on April 1st. So the school takes that list of 100 students and looks at all their direct certification match lists and their homeless list and their Head Start list for the 14-15 school year up to April 1st and check marks the children that they find. Well, they found that 50 of those 100 students meet one of the identified student categories. So they take that 50 students and divide it by 100 and come up with an identified student percentage of 50%. So now to determine what percentage of meals can be claimed at the free reimbursement rate, you take that 50% that we just came up with, multiply it by 1.6, and that comes up with 80% free reimbursement rate and 20% paid reimbursement rate. The community eligibility provision basically eliminates the reduced price category. You either receive reimbursement for free meals, or if you're at the situation where you're not getting all the meals at the free rate, it's either free or paid reimbursement. So in this scenario, after the end of the month, if you were to have counted and served 10,000 reimbursable lunches, just as an example, we would take that 10,000 lunches and apply it towards our 80% free reimbursement rate, and that means that 8,000 of those lunches you would get free reimbursement for, the reimbursement of the free rate, and 2,000 of them, or 20%, would be reimbursed at the paid reimbursement rate. Okay? So that is why you have to really think about, especially if a school or school district is at the situation where they're not going to get all of their meals reimbursed at the free rate. Kind of going back, being on community eligibility provision, you're agreeing to provide a no-cost breakfast and a no-cost lunch to all of your students, even if in prior years you had collected money from your students that didn't qualify for meals. So you're no longer collecting any money from any of the students. So you really have to think about, if you're not in a situation where all the meals are being reimbursed at the free rate and have some meals that are being reimbursed at the paid rate, what is the point where you are receiving enough federal reimbursement to cover your costs that offset what you would have collected in meal money from your paid students in the past? It's one of the calculations that I really want schools to think through before they apply to be on community eligibility provision. But if you end up finding out that this is going to be financially feasible for you, the application for the program is actually pretty easy. There is a Word document and an Excel spreadsheet on our Ohio Department of Education website. If you search the term community eligibility, it will take you to our community eligibility page. And they're just right at the top. So you fill out those two documents, and then you'll just send them to the Ohio Department of Education. And then when we get our 2016 sponsor application open in our claims reimbursement and reporting system, then you'll also fill out a little information there. And basically, a CEP school would be on CEP for 4 years unless they decide at the end of the school year by June 30th that they no longer want to participate. Okay? So this slide is just basically saying, you've got two scenarios of being on community eligibility provision. If you're at the situation where you're not getting all your meals reimbursed at the free rate, and the identified student percentage to accomplish that is 62.5%. So if at least 62.5% of your students meet the identified student category, if you were to multiply that number by 1.6, it takes you up to 100%. And you can't do any better than 100%. So if you had a school or district that was applying that was at 70% identified student, it would just bring you up to 100% of the meals reimbursed at the free rate. Now, the beauty of this program is that you can be on it for 4 years, but you don't have to be if you decide it's not financially feasible. But if you are in a situation where you're not getting all your meals reimbursed at the free rate, you can actually apply for a better rate in a following school year. So any school that is not getting all their meals at the free reimbursement rate, I highly encourage them to continue running direct certification in the following school year, and to compare, basically do the same process. Take their April 1st enrollment list of that school year, compare it to all their direct certification match lists and their other categorical eligibility documentation, and see if their percentage has gotten higher. And if it has, then that higher percentage can be applied to your subsequent years. So here's just an example to give us, again, a visual. Let's say that a school applied to be on CEP this year, and they found a 57.9% identified student percentage when they did their matching to their enrollment list and looking at all their direct certification documentation and so forth. So that resulted in a 91.5% free reimbursement percentage. So all the meals that they were serving, they got 91.5% of those meals reimbursed at the free rate, and the other 8.5% at the paid rate. Well, they continued to run direct certification throughout the 15-16 school year, and when they did their calculations as of April 1st of 2016, they found that their identified student percentage had increased to 59.87%. taking that with the 1.6 multiplier, that brings them up to 95.7% of their meals reimbursed at the free reimbursement rate and 4.21% at the paid rate. So it has given them a better percentage, and we can take that information and put it into our system for that next school year. It won't be retroactive to the 15-16 school year, but it can be applied in the system for the 16-17 school year if you find a better percentage. However, if you find that it's a less percentage, basically we just won't do anything. You can maintain that original percentage for the next school year, even if you find that your direct certification identified student percentage has gone down. You can just maintain what you had in the system already. So this non-federal funding source, people get a little bit nervous about this. And again, this is only if you find that your overall expenses are, the reimbursement that you're receiving for the meals is not covering your overall expenses. And in many cases, if you're really close to getting all of your meals at the free reimbursement rate, this is usually not a problem. It's just when you're closer to that 40% identified student rate, which gets you to about 65% of the meals served at the free rate and 35% at the paid rate. And the current paid reimbursement rate for lunches is 28 cents, and I believe for breakfast it's the same. That's not very much money that you're getting for a meal, and you no longer can collect that meal money for those students who would have paid in the past. So you really have to run the numbers and make sure that it's a financially feasible option. And if you have a low cost per meal, it potentially very well could be. But if it doesn't, then the nonprofit food service account, even if you have a healthy balance, is not to be used to offset the cost of being on CEP when it's not financially viable. A school would have to come up with different funding sources to offset that deficit. And that can be, for example, profits from a la carte sales, or if you do outside catering and money is any profit that comes from that, can be applied towards that deficit. And like I said, if you're in a situation where you're really close to that 100% of your meals at the free rate, generally that's not even an issue. So some of the advantages is, of course, all that students receive a no-cost breakfast and lunch. So not only do you have to not worry about money there at the school, collecting the money and so forth, but you also get rid of any problems with over-identification. All the students are on the same playing field. All the students are getting the same meal. Nobody has to feel bad about being a free eligible student or a reduced eligible student. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing to help to incentivize all the kids to participate in the meal program. It could be potential labor savings. If people were being brought over just to do application approvals, maybe their time could be used in another capacity. They don't have to count and claim by student anymore if you decide not to. You just have to know how many student meals that were served. Remembering, again, you have to count them when the kids get the meal. You just don't have to know by their individual name anymore who got a meal. So it does have quite a few advantages, especially specifically to the school meal program. But like I said, I always want to arm people with both sides of the story so that you can make a really well-informed decision. And there are some, not barriers, but maybe challenges to being on the community eligibility provision. Because even though it really wasn't intended to do so, a lot of other programs have relied on that information that comes from those paper free and reduced price meal application forms. For example, for Title I distributions and for E-rate, information has been used off of those paper forms. So if you don't have a paper form coming in from individual students anymore, what will you do? And schools really have to think about that. If you find that you still do need to collect individual student information, you are not allowed to use the specific USDA free and reduced price meal application form. but we do make available an Ohio household income form, which is kind of a very generic form. It asks about the income from the household again, but it can be customized for whatever you need to collect that information for. And I think one of the biggest ones that some schools or districts still collect the information for is for instructional fee waivers. So if you happen to be a public school, your school still wants to collect money for instructional fee waivers, potentially could use this Ohio household income form and call it the fee waiver application form and collect the information appropriate to do the fee waivers through that process. There is some very nice guidance, though, and actually I need to update this because it just came out. A new federal program's CEP guidance came out in the last month or so that updated a lot of questions and answers about how Title I is impacted, or kind of how to think through Title I a little differently when you're on community eligibility provision. And also E-rate just came out with the guidance. And both of those are on the Ohio Department of Education website if you search the term community eligibility. They're just, all the information we've got about community eligibility is on that page. So the disadvantages to think about when being on CEP is the circumstance if a school or district is not getting all of their meals reimbursed at the free rate. How will that financially impact their school meal program? And will they have to find non-federal funding sources to offset any potential deficit of electing to be on the program? You're not collecting those paper-free and reduced applications from individual students anymore, so what will that mean and how will that impact other data collections there at your school or district? And then you would have to identify other procedures if your school or district decided they still needed to know by student free and reduced price meal status. They would have to use other forms or other methods to accomplish that. Now, if you're on any of the other child nutrition programs, such as the Summer Food Service Program, or you want to apply for the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Snack Program as an example, what you do is you take a look individually by school. What is the identified student percentage times the multiplier? And that is the percentage you would use to apply for other child nutrition programs. So, for example, if you have a school that maybe you were aggregating your data together as a group, and you had 10 schools in your district. And so you aggregate your numbers together to apply for CEP, but if you're applying for any of these individual child nutrition programs, you would look at that individual's data for buildings. So you might have a school that is only 20% identified student, but you've lumped it together with other schools and their aggregate data and applied as a group. If that school tried to apply for these other programs, they may not qualify because they may not meet the poverty guidelines. For like the Summer Food Service Program, you have to be 50% free and reduced. But as a grouping, the aggregate group number together would be both appropriate to apply for the community eligibility provision, and they would be claiming based on that aggregate group information. It's just individually to apply for other programs. They may not necessarily qualify. And that's completely fine and legitimate. So if you had a school that was, let's say, 80% identified student, and you wanted to pair that school with a 30% identified student, and you take those together, and the two schools together would have a 55% identified student and multiply it by 1.6. It's completely legitimate. It's allowed by USDA. So as I had mentioned, in terms of counting meals, you can have a simple tally sheet. Like if you've ever been on the Summer Food Service Program, it is a paper that has just a series of numbers, and as children come through the line and have a reimbursable meal, they simply check off the number 1, then the number 2, then the number 3, and then whatever number that is at the end by the time meal service is over is the number of meals they record for that particular meal service. You could do a clicker system. That's completely fine. Now, some schools or districts decide to maintain their electronic system or their ticket system as they had before CEP. It's allowed. You don't have to. The purpose of CEP was to decrease administrative burden. But what we found is some schools, especially larger schools, had situations where the kids would try to get second meals. And so on CEP, you get a no-cost lunch and a no-cost breakfast, but you can only claim reimbursement for one meal per student per meal service period. So if kids are trying to come back through the line for second meals, then you would have to have a system that you would ensure that those second meals are not being claimed for reimbursement, or being claimed a la carte or whatnot. So we've had some schools that have maintained their original system, so not only could they make sure second meals aren't being claimed, but also so that they can maintain a system for kids to be able to pay for a la cartes or seconds or other items or so forth. So it's just another additional thing to consider. In terms of the claims for reimbursement, the claim form is going to look exactly the same as you use now. Simply, what you will do is you will just come up with a total count of breakfast for the month and a total count of lunches for the month, and you'll report those numbers on the claim. You'll report your operating days on the claim and your student enrollment. And basically, those three things is what we'll need for the claim. There'll be a little button that you can click that will let you calculate your CEP meals, and the system will automatically put them in the appropriate category, either all the meals under the free rate or proportion of meals free and paid based on your identified student percentage. So it's actually really easy to submit a claim for reimbursement. You just need those three pieces of information. Now, just like being on the school meal program in general, you're going to have to maintain all your documentation to support your daily counts of meals. So if you're using those tally sheets as an example, you'll keep all of those tally sheets. You'll also do a CN 6 and 7, so by daily count. You'll record by day how many meals were served, and then have the monthly count at the bottom. And then you'll also keep your April 1st enrollment list, all of your direct certification match list, any of the documentation to support that a child was homeless, migrant, runaway, or Head Start, if that was part of your identified student count, and any court documentation that supports that a child was foster. We would need to see that. Actually, I just want to make sure everybody understands that what schools provide to us is self-reported enrollment count and identified student count, basically to get you started for the 15-16 school year. But then what we do is we arrange for an auditor to come on site and take a look at that April 1st enrollment list and all your direct certification match lists to confirm the counts that you gave us were the final counts, if you will. So absolutely, please, in a safe location, make a copy of that April 1st enrollment that you're using to report your counts and your direct certification match list and all of this documentation. Make sure it's all together in a safe location that when we come out to do your audit, there would be no issue in putting that information together and having that readily available for the auditor. We've had more than one situation where the school simply cannot find their documentation and have no documentation to support that their identified student count and have to recreate an enrollment list, and that's a bad situation. So let's try to avoid that. As you're reporting, if you decide to apply, make sure you just keep all that application and direct certification and enrollment information all together in an audit file ready to go. Okay, we kind of already talked about that. You have to maintain your daily counts, your monthly worksheets, those CN 6s and 7s, and then any other documentation that you would normally keep anyway. So for purposes of the audit, you just have to have all that documentation basically that you're using right now to determine your numbers for reporting to us to be on CEP, keep all of that in a safe location together. Okay? So we get a lot of questions, do you have to do the verification process? And the verification process is actually a verification of paper free and reduced price meal application information. You take a certain percentage of that and contact households. Because this is categorical eligible information, you do not have to do the verification process itself, but we do have all of our schools, including our CEP schools, file a verification summary report annually. And basically, your verification summary report, if you have no other schools on traditional application methodology, will be simply filing a check mark that you're on CEP, what your current enrollment is, and it takes like 2 seconds. It's really quick. So you still have to do a summary report, you just don't have to do the process itself. And we'll talk way more in detail if you do end up applying for the community eligibility provision. We try to have quarterly conference calls, webinars, especially in the very beginning of the school year, to talk through some of these nuances that come up during the school year in terms of just data reporting. So when can you apply? You actually can apply right now. If you have already taken a look at all your information and decided within your district, talking to other administration and officials that this is a great fit for your school or district, then it's just a matter of filling out the Word participation form and the Excel-based eligibility worksheet. And again, you can get those on the Ohio Department of Education website. If you search community eligibility, you'll fill those both out, and then you can email those 2 documents to myself, or you can email them to Serena Wilkes. She's our new community eligibility provision program specialist, if you will. And so her email address is just the same as mine. It's Serena, S-A-R-I-N-A, .Wilkes, W-I-L-K-S, and then the education.ohio.gov is just the same as mine. And when we post this final version to the website of the actual PowerPoint slides, I'll be sure to put her information into the slide as well. Okay, so once we get those 2 documents, then we'll take a look at the documents. We'll see if your school or district appears to be eligible to participate, and then we'll try to arrange for an auditor to come out on site prior to the end of the school year, if at all possible, just so we can have those confirmed counts and that you can have that peace of mind going into the next school year. But if that doesn't happen, then we'll have the audits happen sometime around September, October, November of next school year. So in summary, if you're thinking about doing the community eligibility provision, it's meant for highly impoverished schools that at least 40% of the students meet that identified student definition. That is not free and reduced count. Again, just trying to verify that, because unfortunately we've had some schools each year, this is our 3rd year of offering the community eligibility provision, we've had at least 1 or 2 schools every year that reports to us their free and reduced meal count or free reduced eligibility count, and then when we come out and do the audit and try to decipher how many of the kids are actually identified students, then it ends up being that they owe back money. They've been overpaid for the year. So we absolutely want to avoid that. So when you're doing this identified student count, it is your categorical eligible students that are actively enrolled as of April 1st. So your direct cert, your homeless, your migrant, your runaway, your Head Start, and children who are foster children that you have court documentation for. Those are your identified student count. No information from a paper free and reduced application can be used as part of that identified student count. Now, I do get a lot of questions. Well, your identified student count is, let's say, 45%. But you've got all these paper applications that have a food stamp number on it that don't show up on your direct certification match list. Why is that? Well, with household eligibility, it could be that food stamp number is appropriate for somebody else in the household and the kids are not actually on the program. It could be Aunt Susie or Grandma Jan that has food stamps, and it's completely appropriate for the household to put that number on and have the kids on free meals based on someone in the household having food stamps. But for this identified student participation percentage, the kids themselves have to be directly certified or on food stamps, or that extended eligibility has to take place. So what I generally tell people is if you have a food stamp number on an application, you have kids' names that you can't find on the match list, use our direct certification system and maybe use the identified student or individual student lookup and see if you can maybe get the kids' names to come up. If you put other data points like address and parent's name, it could be that maybe their name was misspelled either at the district or at the Jobs and Family Services when it was being entered. Sometimes nicknames come into play. Sometimes a student might have a double name like Sally Ann, and in the direct certification match list, they come up as Ann, but in the district files, they come up as Sally. So if you use the individual student lookup and put address and parent's name in, sometimes the match will come up as a positive match. So you can always look at that and see if maybe you can find a couple more matches or not, but nothing can be used from the paper application itself. You have to provide no-cost breakfasts and lunches to all your students, and you can no longer collect those specific USDA meal free and reduced price meal forms. So if the school is needing that information for another purpose, they really have to think through how they'll collect it in another mechanism. So we very highly encourage the food service director or the food service supervisor to work with other offices within the school or district to talk through these things before a final decision is made. It could affect your funding streams. We haven't seen that too terribly often in terms of grants and things. Usually the grant administrators will think through a different way to collect information or use the community eligibility percentage, but those are questions that would be viable questions to ask now. Okay. However, we are seeing that this program for the schools that do adopt it, they are seeing increases in breakfasts and lunches that they serve daily. They're seeing improvement in test scores and nutrition status of the students. So it really has been a very exciting program to be involved with. Here's just a screen caption of the Community Eligibility Provision website on the ODE webpage at education.ohio.gov. And again, if you search community eligibility, this will come up readily easily. And if you can see in kind of itty-bitty writing, the second and third documents that appear on this page are the two application documents I had referred to, the CEP participation form and the CEP eligibility worksheet. Okay, so it's time for questions and answers. I'll go ahead and leave this slide up so you can take a look at it a little bit more as to what it looks like and jot down which forms you're looking for. Down if you search community eligibility, that should readily come up. Okay, Bakiba, can we go ahead and open up the line for questions?
We sure can. Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you have a question, please press star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you wish to be removed from the queue, please press the pound sign or the hash key. There will be a delay before the first question is announced. And if you're using a speakerphone, you may need to pick up the handset first before pressing the numbers. Once again, if you have a question, please press star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone. And we'll stand by for our first question. Our first question is going to come from Betsy Cornell out of Alliance City School. Please go ahead with your question or comment.
Well, it's obviously after April 1st, so can we still go back and match? Do you have a individual student lookup list as of April 1st that we could do a match with in case some of our paper applications could be considered?
We actually don't. That's a fantastic question. So the requirement is that it's reflective as of April 1st or reflective of April 1st. And while you ask that question, I'm actually furiously trying to get it into the course program to see if the latest direct certification match list that's in there is past April 1st. If it's not, it would still be appropriate. Oh, don't. It's updated as of April 10th. So unfortunately, that individual student lookup is not a viable option at this time because the data has been updated past April 1st. So I apologize profusely, and I'm actually really glad that you brought that up. That would be more of a consideration for next school year if you're trying to maximize your percentages or get better percentages, is to remember that individual student lookup that you can take a look at and see if you can find names of kids that for whatever reason won't come up on the match list.
Okay, and that's additional. We have no additional questions at this time, Bridget.
Okay. So what we'll do is we will have this recording on the website, and we also will update our slides on our CEP website as well in the next week or so. If you have any questions at all about the community eligibility provision as you're deciding to participate or not, please feel free to call us at the Ohio Department of Education. We would be more than welcome to talk through the provision with you. And you can see our telephone number is 1-800-808-6325. So if there's no other questions, then I thank you for participating in our webinar today, and let us know if we can be of help in making your decisions on the community eligibility provision.
Thank you so much, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.